So the caption here is single cell sitcoms. You see all the little squares on the screen. And the song is, that's the way we became the bacteria bunch. If you've seen the Brady Bunch, it's a joke on the Brady Bunch. And this is supposed to be a single cell organism. Every once in a while, the computer inside this decides it wants to focus on me instead of the screen. And so you'll get those flashes and I have to tap on the screen and get it to shift back over. As I move in and out, it gets confused. That's also why I lean in and do stuff occasionally. So, my pen. Cells. Little chambers surrounded by lipids, so the watery material inside is somewhat isolated from the watery material around the cells. You still need watery material around a cell for it to be active because stuff's got to be able to go in and out, and water's how it does that. If you're looking at a cell that's not in water, it better be sealed up in a way to keep it alive until it can get into water. We're just big bags of water, so our cells are surrounded by tissue fluid, so they can be active. Not these cells. That's why these cells are dying and flaking off. They're drying and away they go. But we got to go back like 100 and, how many years? 190 years? Something like that. Two researchers working in microscopes studying cells. A guy named Schleid and a guy named Schwann. One of them's looking at animal cells, one of them's looking at plant cells. And they kind of got together and came up with some rules that we now call the cell theory. And this is kind of cool in that it hasn't needed to be changed much in all of that time. They came up with some pretty basic, pretty vague rules that apply pretty well to the cells that you find in the world. And there's 4 basic rules of the cell theory. Everything alive are cellular. Everything you find that's alive is at least one cell. It turns out most of the living things on the planet are only one cell. There's way more of them than there are of us. But you can be multi-celled, you can be single-celled. This is a problem people have with viruses. Viruses violate this rule, and it's a very old, very long-standing rule. Doesn't mean that the viruses aren't necessarily not alive because they don't follow the rules, but that's what people do because we're people and we do that. So that's the first rule. I have to put in a different color because here's the only real change since they put this together. When people first started to find single-celled stuff out in the world, you look at pond water and it's full of this stuff swimming around. They got confused and they weren't sure where these things came from. If you take a drop of ink, old India ink, and you put it in a drop of water, spread it out, and put it under a microscope, the particles dance around because they're so small and the movement of the molecules inside it tends to shake them. They call it Brownian motion. So when people looked at things they knew weren't alive and they moved under the microscope and then they looked at single-celled stuff moving, they started to think maybe the cells were coming from non-living material. And Schleid and Schwann came along and went, no, cells are only life from life. You're only getting cells from other cells. Now, they didn't have this related part. And decades following Schleid and Schwann, as people discovered that when folks had illnesses, if you took a scraping off of their sore throat or took a scraping out of an infected wound, and you looked at it under the microscope, there were all of these weird cells in there. We would call them bacteria. And for a while, they thought that when you got sick, your cells transformed into bacterial cells, because nobody knew about spores, nobody knew about how they could get into a wound from the world, or how they could get from a person to a person into your throat. So they just kind of figured our cells were changing into these cells associated with illness. And it took a while to realize, nope, bacterial cells, you only get bacterial cells from other bacterial cells, other related cells. Our cells can only make cells like us. So cells only come from other related cells. When you look at the plant cells that we're going to use for the microscope lab, and we're going to use again for the diffusion lab, you'll see these little green things moving around in there. And Schlein and Schwann saw that. They would look at cells and see things inside that were doing things, that were active. And they decided that, yes, those are just parts of cells. They are not themselves living things. So they're saying the smallest thing that is going to be considered alive, in quotes, is a cell. So this is more of a labeling issue, where they're basically saying, I don't care what you find in there. If it isn't cellular, we're not going to consider it as its own living thing. It's another issue with viruses. I choose to believe that this is kind of a mission statement. And even back when Schlein and Schwann were alive, they would be at a meal with their relatives or a meal with friends, and the people would go, so what do you do? And they would tell them, as we science people, we tell our friends and our relatives what we do, and you see their eyes glaze over. You try to keep it simple, but they're not used to working in that area. And then invariably they kind of go, okay, what can you do with that? They want to see applications. How does this relate to the world? Kind of, how can you make money with that, sort of? And almost whenever you read like press releases from discoveries, at the end, they always tell you what they can do with it or what they can't do with it. And if you're in science, you look at it and go, well, that's crazy. They're never going to do that. But they kind of put it out there to make, to connect it to the real world, sometimes to get into the brains of people who are going to possibly give them money later. But we want to be able to have people understand what we do and understand that it's important. And Schleiden looked at, one of them looking at plant cells, one of them looking at animal cells. They realized that the cells had a lot of stuff in common. And that meant that they could say, yes, I'm studying, cells in tiny plants, but the stuff I'm discovering can apply to all sorts of agricultural products, all sorts of crop plants. So when people go, what can you do with that? You go, I'm finding out stuff that's kind of basic and universal. Animal cells will figure out what happens in human cells. So it's sort of a lie. If I gave you an assignment and said, give me 2 columns of the ways that cells are similar and the ways that cells are different, and one of your buddies went, I know somebody who took this class before. He wants the difference list to be longer. You give me a longer list of differences than similarities. But cells are pretty similar. We're going to kind of depend on that when we talk about cells for the next couple of chapters. Oops. I have run out of plastic. So I'm going to stop this one early so I can swap out the material that I'm writing on.